Good evening. My name is Patrick Lewis, and I'm the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my good friend and tonight's speaker. Adam H. Domby is an award-winning historian of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the American South. He is an assistant professor at the College of Charleston and the Associate Director of the Pearlstein-Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. His lecture tonight is based in his new book, The False Cause: Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory, from the University of Virginia Press. I'll now turn the program over to Adam and rejoin after his presentation to moderate questions.
Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm just gonna fire up my PowerPoint if I can do this right. Hopefully that you guys are now seeing that. Let me know, Patrick, if they can't see me. Thank you so much for having me. First, I want to thank the Filson and everyone involved in hosting this program. I think this is my third time speaking for the Filson technically. And so I wish I got to be there in person, but given a global pandemic, this will do. And I'm really excited to be here. Now, as Patrick mentioned, I am a historian of the Civil War. And because of that, I want to give you guys a quick warning that some of the topics we're going to discuss today may not be appropriate for small children and may be upsetting. In fact, they're not upsetting, that may be more upsetting. We're going to be discussing racism, slavery, sexual assault, white supremacy. There's going to be quotes that are racist. We will not whitewash the terrible details of the past. As a historian, we do not run from the awkward facts, we run toward them. Now, as you may know, Louisville has had some monument removals, as have other areas across the South. Monuments have been removed sort of in a growing trend we're seeing in the last 5 years, and we're seeing a shift. And why do people want these monuments to be removed, I'm often asked. And we're going to talk a bit about that today. And I should warn you, I don't have an answer for what we should do with monuments. This isn't what I'm here to do today. I'm here to give you guys an understanding of what these monuments were designed for, what sort of their creators wanted them to do, and the work that they were meant to do. And so I think we need to start up there with what the limits of a historian's job are. I don't have necessarily the solutions for problematic monuments. I can give you the context, but it's ultimately left to communities, I think, to decide what to do with these monuments. And so the book, which I encourage you all to purchase, obviously, makes an argument up front that monuments are not only served up, they not only served to uphold white supremacy, but they were actually erected to help instill a narrative of the past that's based on falsehoods. In other words, the lost cause, which we're going to define in a minute, was both racist and a lie. And so I want to start off with just what Confederate veterans felt these monuments represented. And we can look at this really easily because they were so many dedications, and the records from these dedications exist. And so you may hear people claim today that Confederate monuments celebrate Black and white Confederates. And I should warn you right now, there's some inaccuracies there. There were not thousands of Black Confederates. This is a myth. Kevin Levine has taken it apart quite ably in his new book. And it's a myth that was created really in the last 50 years. And how do I know that? Well, there's extensive historical research by other historians, but perhaps the easiest way is that the Confederacy explicitly banned the enlistment of Black troops until March, and there's an absence of any documents showing masses of Black troops. And most importantly, perhaps, I can look at what Confederate veterans said 50 years after the war on the topic. And so, ironically enough, Confederate veterans who put up or helped put up these monuments would be shocked at claims there were thousands or tens of thousands of Black men who served in the Confederacy, because they were quite clear that these monuments were connected to white manhood, and that Confederate soldiers were supposed to be remembered as examples of white manhood. And so I want to move, we're going to start with a Kentucky monument. I promised Patrick Lewis that I would make sure to include some Kentucky monuments. We're going to start in Owensville, Kentucky. This one was put up in 1907. And at the dedication of this monument, before quite a large crowd, Captain W.T. Ellis, formerly of the Orphan Brigade, declared, and I'm going to quote now, he said, "Confederate soldiers represented the purest type of Anglo-Saxon manhood that ever graced the ranks of an army. Now, Anglo-Saxon, of course, is just another word for white. And so here he is at the dedication of this monument saying that Confederate soldiers represented the purest, and that's about racial purity, of course, Anglo-Saxon manhood. And then he was not alone. This was not sort of a sidebar, one guy saying this. In 1912, in Princeton, Kentucky, a monument was dedicated by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they made most of these monuments, I should note. Women played a very important role in the creation of monuments, and they were aided by veterans as well. Excuse me. Now, there at the Princeton, Kentucky monument, when it was dedicated in 1912, Bennett Young spoke. And let's talk about Bennett Young for a minute. He was a Confederate veteran who'd been captured and escaped to Canada. And while in Canada, he came up with this idea, which he thought was brilliant. He was going to lead a raid from Canada into the US to cause problems for the United States, so they'd have to put troops up along the Canadian border. So in 1864, he and 20 other men basically robbed a bunch of banks in St. Albans, Vermont, and then escaped across the border. Now, one townsperson was killed, and they tried to set the village on fire, but they failed. They were not very good at arson, it turned out. And instead, they just burned one building. And they were arrested in Canada and almost extradited, but the extradition efforts failed. But after the war, because he'd been involved in this bank robbery scheme, he couldn't return home for a few years. And so he ends up going over to Europe to study, because he wasn't included in the original amnesty. But eventually he's able to come home back to Kentucky, to Louisville, and live there. And he before eventually, of course, ending up in Cave Hill Cemetery. But before that, before he passes away, he became a leading Confederate veteran, and in fact was the head of the United Confederate Veterans. So at this dedication in 1912, what does he say? Well, he discussed, like so many of these monument dedications, he discussed how brave Confederates were. And he said, he was talking about how well they fought. And then he noted, it was the Kentucky boys, the purest Anglo-Saxon organization ever gathered together with their gallantry and unbounded devotion to the cause of the Southland, that have made their names shine with such resplendence amid the stars of the war's firmament. Now again, you have the same language where he's arguing that they are the purest Anglo-Saxon, that they should be remembered. So each time you see this happening, what they're saying is that they should be remembered not just as brave soldiers, but specifically as white soldiers. It was very important to them that they were pure and white. This was important because they were trying to celebrate the purity of whites and white race. They wanted to celebrate the success of white supremacy. If you'll note, the years that these are going on, it's after Jim Crow is pretty firmly in place that you see these monuments go up. So this isn't me making things up or interpreting these monuments to say that these individuals thought they were celebrating the success of white supremacy. This is them. This is what they said when they dedicated these monuments. And I should point out that Young and Ellis's statements were not abnormal. In fact, they were quite normal. These were pretty typical as you start reading. I've read a lot of these dedications, and Bennett had made a similar statement at the dedication to the Danville, Kentucky monument 2 years earlier in 1910. And he then would go on the next year to get elected to the head of the United Confederate Veterans. And it's not despite him having these racial views, but because of them. And I should point out, when I set out to find Kentucky examples, because I had told Patrick I would make sure to mention Kentucky, it wasn't hard. You too can do this research. You can look up what was done at your local dedications. Websites like newspapers.com and Genealogy Bank make it very easy to access local newspapers. Once you have a dedication date, it's easy to find reporting on a monument's dedication. Local historical societies often have clippings. And I pulled these 3 examples rather quickly. And sometimes it takes a little longer, and we'll talk about another example later, to actually find the speeches. But I want you guys to realize, those of you and you folks who are here, to realize how easy it is for you to do this sort of research. And when you look at enough of these monuments, you see this becomes a trend. And even at those dedications where they don't use such explicit language about white supremacy, it becomes very clear that these monuments are still tied to white supremacy because they're part of a larger narrative. They were part of a larger narrative that was celebrating white supremacy. And exactly how they do that is what we're going to talk about. they were pushing the narrative of the past that served to justify Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow sort of social order. And so let's talk for a minute about what I mean by a narrative of the past, what we call the lost cause, or as the book terms it, the false cause, right? And the false cause was a narrative of the Civil War and the era around it that was fundamentally about upholding white supremacy and remembering the war in a flawed way. And so I want to go over real quickly sort of 4 basic tenets of the lost cause. And in every era, every person had a sort of their own version of this narrative. Of course, it's when you look at historical memory, there is variation, but all of them would have probably come back, all of the sort of proponents of the lost cause would have come back to these key 4, what I would call lies. And the first was that slavery was not the cause of the war. The second was that slavery was supposedly benevolent and enslaved people were happy. A third was that Reconstruction disrupted a sort of idyllic antebellum race relations where everyone was happy and led to a corrupt period of misrule. And finally, that Confederates were the most valiant and dedicated dedicated soldiers, period, of all time, that they should be remembered as the greatest soldiers of all time. So let's go through these one by one briefly to talk about whether they're true or not. And the first is that slavery supposedly was not about slavery at all. Or sorry, the Civil War was not about slavery. This belief is quite clearly false. All we have to do is look at the declarations of secession to know what the war was about, because they literally told us when they seceded what the war was about in their mind. Mississippi made it quite clear when it seceded. It said, "It is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course." In other words, we should say why we're doing this. And the next line is, "Our position is thoroughly identified with slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." And they would go on to then list all the ways slavery was threatened. And the rest of the document is literally just a list of ways slavery was threatened. That's it. There's no mention of a tariff, no mention of taxes. The only mention of states' rights is really to explain that northern states were ignoring a federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act. And so historians really agree that slavery was central to the coming of the Civil War. So we know that slavery was fundamental to the cause of the war, but what about the nature of slavery? Now, a lot of people think they were denying slavery as a cause because it was embarrassing to be tied to slavery when we look at this. But it's not just that. I mean, that may have been part of it for those who acknowledge it, but that second tenet makes us have to question that, because they were willing to argue that slavery was benevolent. And I would argue that the key reason early on that sort of Confederate veterans denied the cause of the war was that if you denied the cause of the war, you could deny you actually lost. Follow the logic with me for a moment. If you fought a war for states' rights and you still have states' rights, had you really lost? No. If you'd fought a war for slavery, you were a loser. Slavery was dead. And indeed, states' rights was a key element in protecting the Jim Crow order from federal intervention. Now, in time, this denial began to serve a second purpose of avoiding being tied to slavery, which was morally problematic. And it may have already been playing some role in that, but at the same time that they were denying the war was about slavery, the same individuals in the same speeches would argue slavery was benevolent. So let's look at this one. It's a pretty easy one to get rid of. And here we have 2 advertisements. These are advertisements that I found in newspapers. We'll look at the one on the left first, and I've highlighted the key lines. It's a reward ad for an enslaved person who's run away, a fugitive, because they didn't like being enslaved. So there you can tell right there that not all enslaved people are happy. And you'll notice that the reward offered by James P. Moore is a reward of $25 for the delivery of said Peter to me at my plantation alive, or $50 for his head. Now, when you read that, you got to do the math for a minute, and you realize this enslaver here is asking not for his enslaved bondsman to be returned alive. He wants him returned dead. The fact that he is valuable property is not protecting him. That is a myth that it would. And this is not actually uncommon to find advertisements like this. And so if Peter's caught, it's a good bet that Peter's coming back dead. His life is on the line when he ran. And let's turn to the other one. This is for a woman who was either a runaway or stolen. And I'll let you guys decide whether you think she was a runaway or she was stolen as we read the rest. And I wanted to read it describes her as tall and black. And a few days before she went off, and this is what Michael Rick says, I burnt her with a hot iron on the left side of her face. I tried to make the letter M. So he tried to make the letter M on her face. He branded her face with the letter M. And he's wondering, was she a runaway or she stolen? I will submit to you, she ran away. Now there's more to this story if we keep looking, if that's not horrible enough. And remember, Ricks is not embarrassed by the fact that he tried to brand her. He put this in a newspaper with his name. And as you read down, you find out that she took with her 2 children. One of them is described as as dark-skinned, the other as lighter-skinned and with blue eyes. It seems possible that perhaps the father of that child may have published this advertisement and that she was the victim of rape. So, knowing sort of the way that slavery is, it's pretty clear that this is not an enjoyable experience. They both ran away, they've been tortured here. And we move on, we can actually look at the sale of enslaved people. The advertisement on the top actually lists the prices. And you'll notice that best men sell for $2,200 to $2,500. And you can read all the things, but I want to highlight something here. Fancy girls sell for an equal amount. And in fact, in one case, the most expensive slave sold at this market in particular was an enslaved girl, meaning she's quite young, who's light-skinned and sold for significantly more. Fancy girl meant sex slave. This is an advertisement in a Southern newspaper from the antebellum era, openly advertising the sale of sex slaves. And if you look at the second advertisement there, I've highlighted it, Martha, age 12 years, fancy girl, the likeliest in the city. They're advertising a 12-year-old as a sex slave. That is the reality of slavery in the antebellum era. And I put up 2 books that I highly recommend for those looking to learn more about slavery. Stephanie Jones Rogers just won a big award, and Dana Ramey Berry's books are excellent and really do get into the reality of slavery. Now, we now know slavery was not benevolent. If we needed that, hopefully we didn't. And again, you don't have to take my words for it. You can literally take the words of enslavers, the slave owners. They're the ones who publish those advertisements. And so let's then look at this issue of Reconstruction disrupting antebellum race relations. Well, we already know that antebellum race relations were not idyllic. So that's part of the story is already kind of broken. But let's look at Reconstruction for a moment and what it was in reality. Reconstruction, according to Eric Foner, was an incomplete revolution or an unfinished revolution. It was a period in which universal male suffrage was established, where closer to equal rights than had ever been experienced in the United States. The first public education systems, in many cases designed by African Americans, were instilled across southern states. You had Black elected representatives. For the first time, African Americans had the right to testify against their accusers. This was a period of incredible progressive change. And there was not actually more corruption than at any other period. In fact, probably less than other periods in American history. And again, I've listed 3 books here: Educational Reconstruction by Hillary Green, Eric Foner's New Second Founding, and Stony the Road by Henry Louis Gates, for those who want to know more about the reality of Reconstruction. But Reconstruction was not a period in which, there was mass corruption. It was a period, though, where African Americans had the right to vote. And that, in the minds of white Southerners, when these monuments went up, was its great crime. But why do this? Well, if you have a belief that you had idyllic race relations before the Civil War, and Reconstruction caused problems because of giving the right to African Americans to vote was the problem, right? That's what caused race relations to break apart. Then the instituting of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement of African Americans by that narrative of history was just fixing race relations. In reality, of course, we know that it was actually the recreation of an oppressive system, because race relations weren't good before the Civil War. But a false narrative of history helps justify Jim Crow. And so I want to move on then to sort of our last major myth. And this is perhaps the most exciting and interesting one. Now, I want to note before we get too deep into this, that Kentucky, of course, has its own unique lost cause memory. Kentucky, I'm not going to discuss it in depth, but it is worth highlighting that somewhere in the order of 35,000 Kentuckians served in the Confederate Army, but 125,000 served in the Union Army, depending on who you ask. And included in that number is somewhere in the order of 24,000 African American troops. In other words, more white Kentuckians fought for the United States Army than fought for the Confederacy, by a long shot. And so the lost cause's power as a narrative can really be seen in Kentucky. The fact that Kentucky's commemorative landscape so thoroughly celebrates the Confederacy and not the United States, and that for some reason Kentucky can, according to one of the monument builder, stand high on the list of Confederate monument builders, is a testament to the success of the lost cause mythology and the misremembering of the past. Now, not everyone would have agreed with Bennett when he said Kentucky had the purest strain of Anglo-Saxon blood. If Kentucky had its own mythology, so did other states. In North Carolina, for instance, Julian Carr was, and this is a picture of Julian Carr in his Confederate general's uniform, was perhaps the leading, and he would have argued, he was the leading Confederate sort of speaker. He'd go to Confederate monument dedications, he'd go to Confederate memorial days. And the reason we think Confederates fought so well, I would argue, is because they claimed they did. And Carr was one of those who loved to talk about how Confederates were the greatest soldiers since Thermopylae. And they always compared themselves to Thermopylae for some point. But he would have disagreed that Kentucky had the purest strain of Anglo-Saxon blood, because he would have said, no, it's North Carolina. In fact, he did this quite often. He said North Carolina. The issue, of course, for Carr was not that he was claiming Confederates were bad soldiers. The issue was who was purest. And they probably could have settled on the fact that both were really pure in the end, because they both had a vested interest, both Bennett and Carr, who were friends, I should point out. And in fact, Carr not only helped put up monuments in North Carolina, also helped put up monuments in Kentucky. And so before we get too far into Carr, though, I want to explain how this narrative plays a role, right? This narrative, how does this narrative of the lost cause help justify white supremacy? Well, right as these monuments are going up, African Americans are being disenfranchised across the South. And they use a thing called the Grandfather Clause. The Grandfather Clause basically said that if you could vote, or your grandfather could vote, before January 1st, 1867, you didn't have to take a literacy exam. Otherwise, you did. Now, why at January 1st, 1867? Well, because in March of 1867, African Americans began being allowed to vote. And so what this meant is functionally, if you were white, you didn't have to take a literacy exam. If you were black, you did. And one of the ways they justified this move was to claim that African Americans had not proven themselves yet like white men had. White men had proven themselves at Gettysburg, politicians would say, in 1901. But African Americans had. Now, they're ignoring, of course, the thousands of black Southerners who'd fought for the United States and helped win the war, as opposed to those white Confederate soldiers who lost the war. But why let facts get in the way of a good story that justifies disenfranchisement and the grandfather clause? And of course, these literacy exams were often included trick questions that would keep you from being able to pass even if you had a PhD in history. They could say that you failed. And by portraying white heroes, I should note, it provided a white hero to look up to and informed an audience that they should aspire to such purity, and that a belief in white supremacy was noble. So I'm going to turn now to this guy Carr and explain who was Julian Carr. So he was a contemporary of Bennett Young's and eventually took over the United Confederate Veterans. He was an industrialist, one of the major industrialists of North Carolina. He was a philanthropist. He was very conservative, and it's worth remembering that this is before the party realignment of the 20th century. And so the party that called themselves the Conservative Party was the Democratic Party. And you can see that in how they viewed enfranchisement, for instance. The Democratic Party in the 1890s was a party that wanted to restrict ballot access, and they, as much as possible. And at the same time, the Republican Party wanted to make it easier to vote for everyone and make everyone able to vote as much as possible at the time. So in that one issue, you can see party realignment. Now, he was also a Confederate private. Though he wore a general's uniform, he was actually just a private, but he became the head of the United Confederate Veterans. He was a vehement white supremacist. He's the namesake of Carborough, North Carolina, which is perhaps the most liberal town in North Carolina now. So there's some irony there. He was a very popular public speaker, perhaps the most popular in North Carolina, and he was a crucial player in the creation of Confederate monuments across the South. One of the monuments he helped fund, the Jefferson Davis Monument in Fairview, Kentucky. And like other lost cause advocates, he rewrote the war to help make him look like a hero. And here is a photo of Julian Carr. You can see him in the sort of red circle in the middle, giving a speech at a dedication for a monument at Bennett Place in North Carolina. And here you have him rewriting the war. So this is the actual speech he gave that day that photo is taken at. And one of the things he says is, "We lost, but we won," which is a very ironic thing to say when you're literally giving a speech at the site of the largest surrender of Confederate troops ever. This is basically the big surrender after Appomattox that he's speaking about at the Bennett House. And yet he's claiming there's victory. How can he say that? Well, he would go on to explain the reason is because though they lost the war, on the issues they've since won. Over time, they've reclaimed what they lost, meaning whites were back on top. And at some speeches, he was even more explicit. And so let's turn now to perhaps his most famous speech, the one he gave at the dedication in 1913 at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, when they dedicated their Confederate monument. And this was the speech in many ways that led me to this book. And during that speech, he said, "I am persuaded." Well, first off, he said that Confederate soldiers were amazing, of course, because he always said that. And then he said that the current generation scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war. In other words, during Reconstruction. When he argued, quote, "Their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South. When the bottom rail was on top," in other words, when African Americans had power, that's what the bottom rail was on top meant. And anyone listening on that point in 1913 would have known that's what it meant. "And today, as a consequence," he said, "the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 Southern states. Praise God." That's his words. Now, lest you think he was just celebrating political success, he went on to be very explicit on what he meant about how they had been successful in retaking power for white people that this monument was celebrating. He said, "Let me tell you what I did. One illusion. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox." And then he says the most disturbing words I think I've ever read in an archive. "I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds," because she'd spoken back to a white woman. She'd publicly maligned a white woman. And for that, he whips her. He reasserts the racial hierarchy of the antebellum era during Reconstruction, and he's proud of that fact. He was a proud member of the Ku Klux Klan and said as much. And so he saw these monuments as celebrating the overturning of those outcomes of the war he found most objectionable. That's what this monument meant to Julian Carr. And remember, Julian Carr was invited not despite these views, but because of these views. And I should point out, this speech was so unremarkable that it didn't get reprinted in the newspaper. Instead, they just mentioned that Julian Carr gave a great speech in the local newspaper or something to that extent. And I had to go into the archives, into his personal papers, to find the actual words that he said. And he would say similar things again and again and in previous years. This was why he was elected, not despite this, that he got elected to be the leading Confederate soldier or the leading Confederate veteran. And now his racial views, I should point out, many people cited say he was a moderate. And in fairness, he was a moderate among Democrats of the time. He was not a moderate, though, if you compare him to the Republicans and populists of the time. And he would have, this is an important aspect when we look at someone like Carr. Carr would have agreed. He would have called himself a friend of African Americans. In fact, he did quite frequently. But he was very explicit on the limits of that friendship. And that was, the limits were as long as they maintained their place. Because for Carr, racial hierarchy and racism and his desire, his willingness to use violence against African Americans had nothing to do with hate in his mind. Racism doesn't require hate. It was about social order. Racism is about power and policy and control and who's on top and opportunity and privilege. And so for him, he could see himself as being a friend of African Americans at the same time as he was proud of being violent against them. Now, he's only, again, a racial moderate among the conservative party of the time. If you move over to those radical Republicans, then he doesn't seem so much anymore. And in 1900, let's look at his Senate campaign. He runs for Senate in the primary. And this is a fascinating thing because this primary between Julian Carr, Alfred Waddell, and Furnifold Simmons are the sort of key players. There's another guy, but he's not really he doesn't have much of a role in this. Their goal in this campaign, as they're trying to win the Democratic primary, is to be the biggest white supremacist, to convince everyone else they're the biggest champion of white supremacy. Furnifold Simmons argues that he's the guy because he helped arrange the 1890s white supremacist campaigns that had put his party back in control of the state. Alfred Waddell put himself forward as the best white supremacist because he'd helped lead the Wilmington Massacre, where he murdered African Americans, and essentially the only coup in American history that was successful. He helped lead in Wilmington. And Julian Carr said he was the biggest white supremacist, that he was the champion of white supremacy, the all-winning issue, as they said at the time, because he'd been a Confederate soldier. His Confederate service was his calling card to prove his chops as a white supremacist in this campaign, because in 1900, being called a white supremacist wasn't a bad thing if you were trying to win the Democratic primary. It was, in fact, a prerequisite for election. Now, Furnifold Simmons would win, and Carr would not. He would not be seen. But during this campaign, something came up. Carr's military service was questioned. There was a pamphlet published in, I believe it was in Asheville, the first time it shows up that I've been able to find it, that claimed that what is Mr. Simmons' 1 year of service in the Comfortable office in Raleigh during the campaigns of 1898 and 1900 to Jules Carr's 3 years in the trenches? 3 years, they said. Now, this was great if you had 3 years in service, but this was not a swift boat situation where when his service was questioned, it wasn't necessarily fair. This was pretty fair to question his service because Julian Carr had not served for 3 years. It was closer to 3 months than 3 years. And in fact, we know very little about his service. We know, for instance, that he had a deferment for college for quite a while. We know, for instance, that he was eventually conscripted. He was not a volunteer, despite him frequently claiming he was a volunteer. Records from the Civil War make clear he himself was conscripted. He then avoided service for a while by working for the Conscription Bureau, forcing others to go fight. And then finally, when he does get forced to go join the Confederate Army, he manages to get detailed as a messenger. And there's some question over exactly how much fighting he actually saw. We don't know. The records don't speak to it. But it is pretty clear that he exaggerated his service at least, or at least his campaign did in 1900. And this constant exaggeration of how wonderful Confederate soldiers were and how well they fought ignored the very reality that North Carolina, in the case of Julian Carr, had the highest rate of desertion of any state in the Confederacy. So did Confederate soldiers fight better than any other soldiers ever? Some may have, some didn't. Not all Confederate soldiers volunteered. In fact, the very guy, Julian Carr, who would say repeatedly how much UNC students rushed off to war, he would constantly claim that UNC soldiers had volunteered for the war, himself was a conscript. So I don't know if Confederates, how to judge necessarily if Confederate soldiers were as good as Spartans. There's very different conflicts. But I will say this. The Confederacy lasted 4 years. And there's a lot of reasons they lasted 4 years. At the beginning of the war, though, the United States military numbered around 16,000 men. It was tiny. By the end of the war, it'd be near 1 million. It'd be around 1 million men would be in the United States Army. That takes time to massively expand your military. When you think about how long they last once Grant and Sherman sort of take over the larger war effort, it's not very long. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, George Washington have all fought wars against what was at the time considered the most powerful military in the world and lasted longer. And the United States military was not considered a world-class military. Now, part of the reason for that was because of how the Confederacy had to fight the war, because they were fighting a war to protect slavery. They couldn't use Washington's strategy of sort of falling back and surrendering territory when necessary. They couldn't use an insurgent strategy of the modern era because of a variety of reasons, not the least of which was if they'd done that, slavery would be dead long before the war came to an end, because if they surrendered territory, slavery would die in that area. And so, did Confederate soldiers fight better than any other soldiers? Some did, some didn't, maybe. But the reason we think they did, it is enough to say, I would argue in the book, and one of the arguments I made. The reason we think they fought so well has more to do with memory than reality. And so there is a need right now among military historians to go back and look at the Confederate soldiers using historical memory as a methodology. Because the narratives that Julian Carr, Bennett Young put forward survived and continue to survive in our military history. And for those of you wanting to learn more about this idea of historical memory and about monuments, I've got 4 books here. Start with mine, of course, The False Cause. But if you're interested in learning more about Kentucky specifically, Anne Marshall's Creating a Confederate Kentucky talks about how Kentucky really joined the Confederacy after Appomattox. David Blight's Race and Reunion is sort of the classic work, and he, I think, is coming to speak soon at the Filson. And of course, women played a key role in the creation of the lost cause memory. They were key, the daughters and wives of Confederate veterans were key players in the creation of these narratives of history. And Karen Cox has written the definitive work on them, the Dixie's Daughters, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, which really looks at their role in sort of propagating a narrative of history that was not only fundamentally false, but fundamentally racist. And so I will conclude there, and I'm happy to take questions. And I think Patrick will be the sort of question giver.
I'm going to moderate. Thank you so much, Adam. That was really fantastic and raised a lot of interesting points. If people are not already looking at the chat, I really suggest you go in there, take a look. We've got some really excellent resources in there so that you can keep your research going after this talk, but also some good questions. And if you have any more, feel free to drop them in there. One we got really early that is near and dear to my heart is what about Southern white Union veterans? Mentioned Kentucky, but obviously in North Carolina, we're going to have a lot of that too. How do they take this Confederate memory shift in the late 19th century?
So that is a wonderful question, and is actually the focus of, in many ways, chapter 3 of the book. It looks at Unionist sentiment. So one of the things that's really fascinating is you actually have individuals who apply for both Confederate and Union pensions at the same time. You have these guys who they're conscripted in the Confederate Army, and then they are captured and they join the United States Army and they go out west. They're called galvanized Yankees, and they go out west, and they sort of are not eligible for pensions from either side because they deserted from the Confederacy, and they, are not eligible because they fought for the Confederacy, right? So either way, they're not eligible. But they apply for pensions from both, and when they apply for their pension for the Confederate, they're like, I was a loyal Confederate. I was so loyal. And then when they apply for their pension at the exact same time to the United States, they're like, I fought loyally for the United States. And so you have this sort of thing. What happens ultimately, there is an era, and this is sort of the topic of my dissertation, what will be my next book, about this sort of legacy of dissenters across North Carolina. North Carolina has a lot of dissent, and it's largely forgotten. And one of the reasons it's largely forgotten is because white supremacy wins out in the end over the appeals to wartime loyalty. As time progresses. By the time you have, say, Aycock running for governor in 1900, he's not a Confederate veteran, so he's not objectionable if you're a Unionist anymore. And so what you have is that becomes an appeal. And in fact, there is a constant, during the Reconstruction era in North Carolina, the Republican Party is constantly having to get the votes of wartime dissenters. That's their key thing. And the Conservative Party, that's what they call themselves. They're not yet the Democratic Party. They later changed their name to the Democratic Party. Will sort of turn around and try to convince those wartime dissenters that they should actually vote along racial lines instead of wartime lines. And so everyone's sort of trying to appeal to them. And so it's a fascinating thing. It's something we haven't studied enough. There are it's estimated that 100,000 white Southerners fought for the United States Army. That is larger than the Army of Northern Virginia was at any one point in the war. So think about that. Another Army of Northern Virginia of manpower you could have had if all white Southerners were really devoted to the Confederacy. Additionally, you have somewhere in the order of over 150,000 formerly enslaved people who joined the United States Army in the USCT and other all-black units. And those soldiers, right, were seen by the Confederacy as potential laborers, not as soldiers, but laborers. So you have this transition, what Du Bois would see as sort of the world's largest slave insurrection, right, of these enslaved people arming themselves and then bringing about liberty, right? And so those aspects of the history have to be erased to justify disenfranchisement. And that's when we talk about historical memory, when I was trained to talk about historical memory, we always talked about what's remembered and what's forgotten. Those were the two elements, right? There's a selectivityness, right? You select what's remembered and what's forgotten. And so one of the things this book argues is that there's a third element, and that is what's just made up. And frequently when you find what's just made up, it's covering up what's been forgotten. And so again, the large number of white Southerners and black Southerners who fought for the United States are getting erased in the lost cause memory.
Fantastic. And we had another really excellent question that wanted to get into how you're finding out what is made up. And where are these documents, particularly the question related to Carr and documenting his military service? What do we have available to us now to be able to check some of these stories that might not have been publicly available to somebody who's reading a speech in a newspaper?
So the first thing we have, and this is the best source, the source that I use constantly, and thank God they digitized it, because if they hadn't, this project would have been a lot harder, is the compiled service records. The compiled service records, what happened was in the 20th century, they went through all the old muster rolls that survived. Now they're incomplete, mind you. So just because it says doesn't say someone was a deserter doesn't mean they didn't desert. In fact, they underestimate desertion by using the compiled service records because the records fall apart in the last year of the war usually. But what they do show us essentially they take the muster roll and they made an index by person, and then it's a carded index. So it's literally every time somebody, Patrick Lewis showed up in the archives, they made a card for him and they put him in an envelope. And so you can go look at those envelopes and take it up and look at each card, and it says Patrick Lewis was on duty or wasn't on duty. Patrick Lewis was, a deserter. Patrick Lewis was AWOL. Patrick Lewis was in the hospital. Every time they show up in the records, you find out. So it's essentially a military record. Those were digitized for all of the Confederate forces. They're currently in the process of doing it for the United States Army forces on fold3.com. They're now in the National Archives, but fold3.com, you can actually access these. And so you can look up your ancestor and see if your ancestor was a deserter, which is always fun to find when you find out they were court-martialed. Now, so that's one way to do it. What then you have to do is you also have to cross-reference it with what they claim, right, later. So you're comparing what was claimed versus what was reality, right? What we know, these documents from the wartime. But you also will find documents from the war period from their very own documents. I'll give you an example. Henry London was one of Carr's buddies. And they worked together on a lot of monuments. He was another leading Confederate. We went to college together, also a UNC student. Also had a deferment because he was at college. He loved to talk about how duty was the most sublime word in the English language. This was sort of like his go-to phrase, or one of his go-to phrases he likes to talk about. Well, he writes a letter, and it's in the same document set that he preserved, that are in the Southern Historical Collection at UNC, to his sister, in which he says to her, I know it's my duty to go fight, but I got this deferment, so you can't expect me to go fight, right? So their very own letters sometimes rat them out as well, because you see the letter from 1862, and then you look at what he claims in 1905. And so it's a lot of cross-reference, a lot of digging. You can't always know for sure. So you have to dig much sort of deeper. And so a lot of times you sort of have to use a sort of, a different standard. You have to sort of think about your standard of evidence. Is there evidence that this actually thing? And sometimes it's really hard, especially when you have individuals who are created. There are some examples in the book that you can read about where people are just made up. They're just created in the 1870s or 80s, and they're not real. And so for that, you have to go back and sort of go, is there any record of this guy? And you have to actually trace the lie. And you trace the lie's evolution. So you find it in 1930 and it says one thing, and then you find it again in 1920 and it's slightly changed. It's just like a game of telephone, right? And you find how the details change. And that's always the giveaway, right? When the details keep changing and then they sort of stop, and the first time you can find it is in 1900, it's a lie. So the story, for instance, about Robert E. Lee supposedly kneeling in church next to a black man who wanted to take communion, it's a made-up story, almost certainly. But the real giveaway is the fact that when you look at the story and how it's used originally to prove that Robert E. Lee was a white supremacist. More recently, it's been used to claim that Robert E. Lee was, in fact, not a white supremacist and was willing to pray next to a black man. Because the story originally, as it's originally told, is that he takes communion and all the white people take communion and none of the black people, and the black guy who's sitting there trying to take communion gets ignored. And so he just ignores the guy. That's the takeaway. In the later retelling, the story is that he kneels next to this guy and they take it together. So, when the story shifts, that's always a giveaway, right? That something's happening. And so it's not always the case. And one of the things that I'm left with is that I'm able to find all of these lies that are in the book, and there are a lot of them. How many are there that we can't find because the documents don't exist? This is why there's so much I question. Any document, any story told after the war is instantly suspect in my mind. Because so often when you dig deeper, you can find hints that something isn't kosher.
That reminds me so much of some exhibit work I was doing a few years ago, and there were some artifacts from a Confederate veteran who showed up to a lot of these events, but didn't start showing up to them until the 19 teens. and had a backstory that didn't quite line up in CSRs, and there were a lot of could-have-beens. And again, it's not anything I can prove, but it sure did stink as a story.
Well, and sometimes you can prove it. I mean, sometimes you can find, one of the things you can do is look at their census records. Census records are really great. When somebody's census record from 1860, 1870, 1880, 1900, and 1910 all say the guy was born in 1860.
Yeah.
And then in 1925, he starts saying he was born in 1840. Who do you believe? You don't mistake someone who's 10 for a 30-year-old. Like, that doesn't happen. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? You use Occam's razor, right? Was he lying for 40 years every time a census taker came for no apparent reason about his age? Or was he lying later? Which one makes more sense? And so a lot of times it's sort of the preponderance of the evidence, but census records are a great way to debunk it. That's one thing you might want to look for that guy, is actually to go look at the census records for this guy and see if he's lying about his age. And in fact, I just had an article, it's coming out, I guess, in the September issue of Civil War Monitor, about the last Confederate veteran of New York. And this guy's around into this World War II. And he's talking about how nobody ever suffered like he did. And he and the boys in the Confederate Army ever suffered. This is like during the Battle of Stalingrad. He's saying that nobody's ever suffered like we did. There's an irony there, right? The guy never served. And one of the giveaways was that he kept talking about how he knew Robert E. Lee and how he like served Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee pulled a bullet from his neck. It's like, there's no evidence Robert E. Lee ever pulled a bullet from anyone's neck. That would be a story that would be retold, right? So you start digging and you find this guy's a fake. So a lot of digging, a lot of deep research.
My guy gave an interview in 42 that said he wanted to take his cavalry carbine and take a pot shot at Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, they always sort of have this, I'm ready to go fight. And the thing is, for every one of these sort of fake Confederates who pretends that they're 95 when they're 85, and then dies at 110, and they have to keep the lie going, right? Because they actually are dying at 100 or whatever. How many more died when they were 85, claiming they were 95, that we don't notice, right? The last 12 Confederate veterans. So the last 12 guys who were claiming they're Confederate veterans weren't Confederate veterans. For every one of those that like outlasted everyone else, how many got their pension and were never noticed? And the answer is a lot.
Got a really good question in here from the chat that I want you to think about. And going back to the first myth of the lost cause that you dealt with about the war and secession being rooted in slavery, do we as an American public have a difficult time recognizing that fact, because they're on the other side, the United States is not, at least at first, fighting a war to end slavery? And does that somehow complicate that public memory?
I mean, I think it plays into it, and I think it does play into it. And I think the fact that that aspect of the lost cause was accepted by many Northerners, because it, in some ways, for certain individuals, that wasn't necessarily what they were specifically going off to war for, right? They're going off to save the Union. The reason the Union's being fractured is slavery, though, right? Like we never can get away from that fact. But if we sort of, if you went to war to save the Union, that's what you're focused on. And especially at the same time, the guy's saying to you, oh man, we fought a war for states' rights, and you guys fought really well, and you beat the greatest soldiers ever. If you're a Union veteran, there's an incentive to buy into that, right? Because it says that you're really the greatest soldier. If Confederate soldiers are the best in sliced bread and you beat them, you're even better, right? And so there is an element there where you often have, and we should always remember, being anti-slavery does not necessarily mean that you're not a racist. And even being pro-union doesn't mean you're anti-slavery. So yeah, that definitely plays a role. I think the bigger aspect, and this is what people like John Singleton Mosby would object to again and again, and he was not only John Singleton Mosby, the Gray Ghost, the Confederate guerrilla commander, constantly complained about fake veterans and wouldn't go to reunions because he said half the people there weren't serving. He had this great quote where he says, if I'd had that many men, that show up to the reunion, I would have run Grant out of Virginia. And and he becomes a Republican also, it's worth noting. This is sort of an important element of his story, is that he rejects the lost cause. The lost cause is so politicized, but he also rejects what the war was about. He says the war was about slavery. I mean, he was willing to acknowledge it. And so when you sort of look at the many reasons why the lost cause is accepted, people will accept stories when it's convenient for them at the time. And so in time, not everyone does accept this. There are people that push back. Julian Carr gets sort of told off at one point when he gives a speech in West Virginia. A Union veteran speaks up and says, hey, we fought, yells back at him, and he sort of has to backpedal and say, well, you guys were good too. And so there is sort of this but there is pushback too. I mean, that's worth remembering, that there are people who are pushing back against the lost cause constantly. Not only white Northerners, but African American Southerners are constantly pushing back. That's why Confederate monuments have been defaced since they went up. There's been a long history of defacing Confederate monuments. Literally, within a week of some of them going up, they get defaced.
Got a point here where the viewer says that both Bennett Young and Basil Duke were among the founders of the old Filson Club, and so therefore have a hand in what we're doing tonight. And asked if their desire to create historical institutions starting in the 1880s comes out of this desire to defend the lost cause. And I think I wonder if you could speak to that sort of across the South, this institutionalization of the lost cause within a historical society, an archive, or a university.
I mean, I think we know that, yeah, they did in many ways want to create these archives as a way of celebrating Confederates. And you look at what documents they collected. I mean, this is something that I know that the Filson is devoted to, is sort of trying to fill the holes of what wasn't gathered in the initial gathering of documents. And when you look at those initial documents that are gathered by, say, the Southern Historical Collection in North Carolina is another great example of the Filson. They're focused on white Southerners of a certain class, usually even. I mean, they're really about celebrating. Their understanding of what history is very different. And so, yes, I think that there is a tie. And I suspect that Bennett Young would not like what I said tonight, especially when I made fun of him robbing a bank as opposed to being a military action. And that is the nature of institutions, right? Is to sort of have to struggle with their legacies and to decide how you deal with that. What does that mean is a fundamental sort of thing that's going on nationwide, I think, as archives look at how their collections were made. And I think that's an important thing to be thinking about. But yeah, I do think a lot of our archives, and it's worth remembering, though, good things can come out of bad ideas necessarily, or bad sort of inclinations. And so they wanted a historical narrative that celebrated them. There's no doubt. And it's worth remembering, it wasn't just to celebrate them. It wasn't just like, I want to be remembered well by the grandkids. It was celebrated them because it supported a political agenda of white supremacy. And that, I think, is the really important thing. And it does bring the question of what does the Filson's responsibility going forward to helping create programming and collecting documents that are going to counter that effort.
I really couldn't agree with that more. All right, last question of the night. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on this term Anglo-Saxon as a way of sort of creating categories within whiteness in the 19th century.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I mean, it's not surprising at all, Anglo-Saxon, that they're using this term. Julian Carr, for instance, who loves the term, is not only a member of the first Klan, he's a member of the second Klan, the Klan that's reborn, that is also anti-Catholic in the 20th century. And he would publicly state in 1924, I think it is, or 23, he publicly states that he's a member, don't quote me on the date, he publicly states that he's a member of the Klan. And so it's a racialized term. It's a stand-in often just for white. You see, it's used very sort of as sort of an overarching term for anyone white. And they're not going to be talking about Irish Confederates anyways, because that's not a topic, because part of the lost cause is that all the immigrants are going to the North and being forced into the army. And so it's sort of this sort of but being sort of accepted as white, this is one of the reasons, you know, certain groups might have fought for the Confederacy, in fact, is that it's a doorway in, and to acceptance. And so there are some examples of that in the book of individuals who sort of try to fight for the Confederacy, but ultimately are rejected as they're trying to sort of pass as white. And so even during the war, this is a sort of issue. But it's a term that, while technically would apply to basically, you know, of a very specific part of Europe, is really being used to encompass their understanding of sort of genetics is not very refined, to put it bluntly. I mean, in the same way that genetic testing today is really problematic when they tell you you're X% from wherever, it's a really problematic sort of science behind that, how that works. But we don't tend to go into that all the way. But I will say that it is an important, they don't even always use Anglo-Saxon though. Sometimes they'll even say white. I mean, sometimes they frequently will use other terms. That just is the easiest term when you're searching in newspapers.com if you want to find it. If you put in monument Anglo-Saxon, you find a list of monument dedications that'll take you a week to get through. But it's used again and again. It's used in the political speech of the time as well. And they often will tie it to other historical figures. So Sir Walter Raleigh, Julian Carr wants to put up a statue to him. They put up a statue to the first, to the only naval officer killed in the Spanish-American War. They used the term when they dedicated to that. Ironically enough, at the time he's killed, in the exact same moment that he's killed, the same shell that kills him kills an African-American seaman standing next to him. They don't put up a monument to the African-American seaman in North Carolina, and that one's in front of the North Carolina State Capitol. And so they're always looking for someone who they can claim is of European or English descent, right? That they can celebrate as another example of white, because this is the Lost Cause isn't just about the Civil War. It's about a larger narrative of history.
That's a fantastic place for us to end. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks for everybody for joining us. Have a good night.